Hey everyone, welcome to today's event, a conversation about changing food habits in the COVID-19 era. I'm super excited to have with me Susan Schwallie, an MPD food analyst, food and beverage analyst that I've known for a couple years. And I really enjoy talking to you, Susan, when I really want to know what's going on. You have a great amount of insights and a great amount of data. So we're going to dive deep into that and really kind of dissect what's happening with the food and beverage behavior of consumers with this new landscape we're all dealing with. So,
Right.
but before we get going, I just want to talk a little bit about the structure of the event. So we're going to have Susan present up top and give some of the insights and market data that MPD is known for, and just share with us some of the signals that they're seeing. After that, we're going to have a conversation, her and I, just chat about what's going on. I may react to some of the slides and presentations she had. And then we're going to go to the audience. If you've been on Crowdcast before, you know that there's this great social sidebar. You can have a conversation. I see that people are already waving and saying hi. Scott Heimeninger from Seattle. Hey, Scott. But also there's that little button down below at the bottom where you can actually submit a question. So feel free to do that as well. So I'm excited about this conversation. Anyone who's watched over the past couple of months can see that consumer behavior is radically changing due to this force majeure event that we call COVID-19. As a one-time industry analyst and kind of practicing marketing and someone who still thinks like a market analyst, it's been a fascinating case study, a once in a lifetime case study to really look how people are changing their behaviors, whether it's like the hoarding behavior or the baking their bread behavior or whatever they're doing. And so I'm really excited to have Susan talk about through some of these and show us some data and then have a conversation. So Susan, I'm going to hand it over to you and let you take it away and give a presentation.
Great. Thank you. Yes. I mean, as if human behavior and food wasn't exciting enough. Unfortunately, dealing with some of the tragedy that's going on around COVID-19, that's clearly not the fun part of this, but it is absolutely fascinating in terms of what's going on. I'm going to focus mostly on what's going on in America. We do have information in other countries to talk about what's gone on with all of these restaurant meals that have come in home and with all of us being in home. So I really appreciate you having me here today. What I want to do is just briefly get us all up to speed on what the current situation is. I'm even going to back up away from food and talk about what we're seeing more broadly across multiple industries, what's going on in retail. Now I'll give you the landscape on restaurant and what that has meant to in-home. Then we're going to focus on what's going on, what we're doing differently in our kitchens and some of the things that we've stocked up on from a home appliance, a kitchen appliance perspective, in addition to the food. And then talk a little bit about the future. Of course, everybody wants to know, what's going to happen, what's going to stick. And if there ever was a time to corner the market on, crystal balls, this is the time. But the best that I can do is put information out there on behaviors that we know are happening and put them in the context of how it's different from other challenging time periods and what we're seeing, for instance, in other markets that are recovering ahead of us, for instance, like China. So I can't, none of us can predict the spread or how recovery is going to happen or how reopening is going to go. But I can talk about what we've seen in terms of consumer response to date, both in-home and in food service. And I will talk a little bit about what happened in the last great recession. It won't be the same results, but I think it was Mark Twain that said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think that's certainly going to be true. Very briefly, because I want to spend our time talking about the consumer, a little bit about MPD, if you're not familiar with us. We are a market research company that helps our clients across 20 different industries and around 20 different countries around the world understand how to drive growth in their industries based on a combination of the rich data sets that we have, as well as our thought leadership and our ability to do prescriptive analysis, analytics with that data. So you can see, I'm going to be drawing from a myriad of sources, but just know that it's a combination of receipt scraping and online shopping, as well as consumer panels, as well as POS, for instance, in the housewares industry. So that's how we understand what consumers are buying and doing. And one of the main sources I'm going to work with is National Eating Trends. For almost 40 years now, we have been tracking what, where, when, how, and why Americans choose to eat and drink, what they do both in home and away from home. So it is truly a total share of stomach. The only other folks that have been doing that ongoing or come close is the US government. So I'm really excited to share this information with you. So let's dive into it. Enough of the setups, right? Let's talk about our current situation. Now, a minute ago, I mentioned I'm going to ask you to step outside of food, and I want to talk a little bit about what we've been seeing in the industries that we track. This is a combination, I'll show you on the next chart, but it's a combination of apparel and beauty and tech and food service, toys, entertainment, etc. What we saw was here, the week ending March 21st, was really when the store closures began at retail, when we saw a lot of stay-at-home policies being issued by governors or municipalities. And also we saw a lot of kids sent home from school, as it turns out, for the remainder of the school year. And at this point, retail really took a dive. Now, a little bit different for grocery, and we'll talk about that because that's where the stockpiling began. But what I want to point out here is that this chart is showing a percent change versus the prior week. And so ever since we hit April, for the almost $2 trillion of retail sales that NPD tracks, we have seen improvement week over week. I don't know if it's because the CARES Act stimulus checks came out, if unemployment started, payments started to kick in. Also, at the same time, consumer sentiment has slowly improved over April as people have started to really look forward to reopening. So that, I think, is interesting that we have started on the path to recovery. We are past the worst, if you will. Here's what it looks like by industry. So the first thing I want to point out here is that the dark blue is versus the week ending April 21st versus last year. And these massive swings are due to the fact that that was Easter week last year. So what I really want to draw your attention to are these royal blue lines, because this is the week ending April 25th versus the prior week. So this is showing us, are we moving upwards week over week and creeping towards a slow recovery? And you'll see almost every industry that we're tracking is up, with the exception of physical video games, because streaming is much bigger there. But let me draw your attention, if you haven't already noticed, to the housewares number. So we're seeing a 9% dollars growth versus prior week for housewares. And housewares has been doing very well throughout COVID. And I'm going to talk about exactly what's driving that. Here's next to it also small appliances. Here's what's happened in terms of restaurant traffic. So what we see here is around the week of March 15th, that middle of the month, we start to see some of those first closures, again, culminating here in the back half of March. And we see a very steep decline as we reached about 97% of restaurants being impacted by closure of on-premise dining. So when those dining rooms shut down, it almost affected every single restaurant in the country. Now you'll see that there's two lines here very closely joined together. The dark blue is total restaurant traffic or visits. And the green is quick serve restaurants. Quick serve restaurants very much so mirror the total trend, because they're 80% of our restaurant trips. Yeah, 80%. Full serve restaurants, which includes a wait staff, usually includes bar alcohol, includes fine dining as well as casual dining. It's everything from the Applebee's and the Red Lobsters to the independent high ends. Really suffered the most getting down here at the very bottom at 80% traffic declines. The simple reason is that quick serve restaurants were already set up for either drive-through or takeout or carry out or delivery, and mobile ordering in many instances. They were more easily ready to pivot their business to focus on that, because in some cases for some of these chains, that was the bigger portion of their business anyway. Much harder for some of the full service restaurants to pivot to curbside or delivery, although we did see it happen. The last thing that I want to point out here is that we have seen in the back half of April an uptick, a bit of a recovery, if you will, going on. And again, this may be due to the stimulus checks, to unemployment monies flowing. We normally don't see an increase in restaurant visits when unemployment goes up. And we know now we are at absolutely unprecedented levels of unemployment. So we also know that people are, making an effort to support their local restaurants, and restaurants are pivoting to also, sell even retail foods. So the one last comment I want to make restaurant before we shift to home, I think is really important to kind of understand the shift that it has on what people are doing. Right now, as of the end of April, with that 32% decline in traffic, what that equates to is about a 6% lift to in-home eating occasions. Now, I want to back up a second, because you might think, gosh, it's got to be more than that. But let's keep in mind that 80% of our meals come from the home supply and only 20% come from food service. Most people don't realize that, because the number that we hear quoted the most in the media is dollars. And in fact, it's about a 50-50 split of 50% of our food dollars going to restaurants or some sort of food service and 50% going to grocery. And that's just because of the disparity in a cost per meal from a restaurant versus in home. But in sheer numbers, the majority of our meals come from home. And when we look at the rate that restaurant meals have come down, it's about a 9% uptick for lunch and dinner. It's a little bit less for morning meal. That's because we just eat that many more meals out at lunch, and they've come in home. And there's some dynamics there. While, again, you might have thought these lift numbers might be greater, these are massive numbers in terms of a shift. When you start to think about it on a per capita basis by 330 million people, it is substantially more meals coming into the home. And in fact, I just want to point out that since the last recession, when a higher percentage of meals it crossed over and started to come in home, that has held true over the last decade. Restaurants, food service did not ever really recover to pre-recessionary levels. And this has been chugging along. So you can imagine even more of our meals right now are coming from in-home. There's been a homing path going on for quite some time. And clearly some of the sales in housewares and kitchen electrics and home decor have shown that we've been nesting and making our home our castle. So what are some other things we can learn from the recession and look for in terms of how consumers are handling being at home and being under the COVID era? So in the last recession, one of the first things we saw was that Americans turned to more batch cooking and made sure that the leftovers were used more often. They didn't as likely languish, they were used, and they were in some instances planned for. We also see that there was a switch to private label or less expensive brands. For some folks, there was a trade down. But I also want to point out that that started before the last recession. It just continued and accelerated in the recession because private label and store brand had done a really nice job at adding value and bringing up quality. But we're going to expect to see some of that also as people manage budgets. We're probably not going to see an uptick in brown bagging or carrying food from home. Not for a while, where so many of us are going to be working from home and staying at home. But also we would expect using less expensive cuts of meat. So ground beef tends to do quite well as poultry does quite well. Now, what'll be different this time is we have some different availability going on due to supply chain disruption. We didn't have supply chain disruption like this in the last recession. We didn't have people, at home as much. There was more unemployment. People were eating in home more, but nothing like today. So there will be some clear differences. The last thing that I want to show you before I talk about what we've observed in March that's happening today is also kind of the winners from the 2008 and 2009 recessionary period. It does not mean that all of these will behave the same exact way, but I do think it's worth talking about this because there are some patterns and there is a rhyming that I see going on. So what this is showing is foods, either the end dish food, so the finished food on the plate, as well as ingredients that were used in those dishes that increased in home between 2007 and 2010. And you can see it's laid out by day part. Some of the trends that you see is, first of all, some of the biggest behaviors in the day parts increased. So more of our eatings during the recession sourced from the home because we pulled back on food service. And we did things like turn to more sandwiches at lunch. We also turned towards one of our favorite accompaniments, chips. And this was during a time that snack foods as part of a meal were growing. We're going to see that repeated in what's going on now, a little bit of the return of the sandwich. In the morning, yogurt was definitely on an upward trend. It was one of the leading snack foods that came into more main meals. We also saw in the ready-to-eat cereal area, family cereal growing. Again, cereal still remains, cold cereal, the largest morning behavior, although it's had some struggles. You can also see that the big behaviors like fruit and milk and coffee went up. And then interestingly at dinner, some of those things that we all have in our repertoires and know how to do very well, we relied on more. A lot of things that I kind of call family favorites, like casseroles and variety dishes, one dish meals, Italian dishes, sandwiches. Now at dinner, it's more likely to be warm or a burger. And then you can see down below all those kinds of just key ingredients that support those kind of family favorites or everyday easy meals like pasta sauce and cheese and rice, etc. And then snacking, we saw nuts and seeds and crackers. Overall, snacking did do well. Okay, so what can we learn from that? Let's talk about what's going on now. So, even before the kids were officially sent home and all of the stay-at-home orders went out, the Americans were starting to see the writing on the wall. And one of the first things they did, even really before stocking up on the food stockpiling started, is we saw categories in our home retail tracking that grew double digits for that first week ending March. And I think it's fascinating. People suspected they were going to be at home more, and they focused on things like water filtration and soda makers, also air purifiers. So things about, our home environment. And then related to food, they purchased kitchen electrics that supported some of those large food behaviors like sandwich makers, pizza ovens, pasta machines, rotisseries. And there was also an aspect of, oh gosh, I have to entertain the kids and we want to do something fun. So ice cream and snow cone makers ticked up during this time. So that was some of the first initial appliances that we turned to. For those of you who know Joe Derechowski, who is our home industry advisor and a colleague of mine, he pointed out that carb-related categories in the kitchen electrics have also been growing. So now as we fast forward into mid-April, we see that sales of these carb-related appliances are growing. So bakeware, Flour did sell out and has continued to struggle to be replenished in lots of markets. Stand mixers, bread makers. Who would have thought bread makers would be back? Waffle irons, so on down the line. Lots of things that support some of maybe those carb and comfort foods that maybe haven't been so popular lately. And then most recently, the data that I have on what's growing in housewares through the week ending April 18th, continued double-digit growth for things in home environment, but now it's shifted away from purifying our water and air to, oh gosh, I have more people, we're always home, how do I keep this home looking decent? So anything related to floor care has driven 2/3 of the growth in home environment. Kitchen electrics, here are the things that are continuing to grow: air fryers, single serve brewing systems, stand mixers are still up. Blending could be related to alcoholic beverages. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then personal care. We have to figure out how to cut our hair. Personally, it's growing out. I'm tucking it behind my ears, and I told my husband he can't come anywhere near me with clippers. But a lot of people have been turning there. And I thought it was interesting, though, electric shaver replacement parts, but maybe that's for the clippers. I don't know. But these are the things we're dealing with. Continuing to feed everyone in the household, keep the house looking good, keep it kept up, and deal with our appearances. On the food side, we are tracking what people are bringing into their pantries, what their stock looks like, how deep it is, how they're using it, so we can understand the pull through. Is it bunker food or is it expandable categories? And what the strategies are that people are employing during this time. Initially when we went out asking our panel about their meal strategies, look at that, 7 in 10 told us that they considered their eating occasions at home atypical. So they were consuming different foods and beverages than normal. Or maybe it was they normally went out on Friday night and now they had to cook in home. Or maybe nobody was home at lunch normally and now they were dealing with that. Or, as some people admitted to us, they had ice cream for breakfast. It really kind of runs a gambit. That number has settled down a little bit, but the last number that I saw, I believe, was in the upper 60s. So we still haven't really hit our stride on our new normal. One of the top strategy that our panelists are telling us that they're using during this COVID period is avoiding food waste, and they're turning to leftovers, which is what we saw in the last recession. And I think it's not necessarily just economically driven. I think it is about the fact that they do see they can't get everything that they need in the store. There are out of stocks, and there's some fear around that. As I mentioned, we have massive supply chain disruption that we've never had before, as well as I think some of it is how do I be efficient with food? Not only from managing my budget, but from getting all of these people fed at all of these meals. It doesn't end. It's throughout the day, all day, we're all home. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about what we're doing to get it done. And I love this meme because it really summed it up. It gave me a chuckle. Cooking at home is now like the show Chopped. You've got frozen meatballs, brown sugar, Pringles, ketchup, and peanut butter. Go. Here's some of the ways that consumers are getting it done. What I'm showing you now are the top appliances that we have seen being used in March of 2020 compared to March of 2019. We don't normally look at just 1 month time frame of data versus year ago in our consumer trackers, but we are able to do it because I think it's important. And as we all know, a lot of best practices are really, really being put to the test right now. But I think you're going to find this information very compelling. So first of all, what I've listed here are the top occasions that we're all most likely to own and use on a daily basis. And stovetop has been and always is, the number one appliance. So this is just share of total in-home occasions in March. And then what we have down below is an index back to the prior year. So what you see here really is we're still using the large appliances pretty much on par with how we did prior to COVID. We're still turning to these to get it done on a day-to-day basis. Toaster's up a little bit. Part of that is because some of the different things we're eating in the morning, like toaster pastry and frozen pancake waffles. Everything else is pretty steady. What's interesting is when we look at the appliances that are smaller in size. So these are less than 2% of all in-home occasions, but they all posted double-digit usage increases. So, and you look at this list and you're going to all recognize many of these as fast-growing items. The multi-cookers, the rice cookers, the air fryers, for example. But we're pulling out these kind of smaller appliances and adding them into our repertoire because all of the sudden, have I mentioned, we have to feed everyone all day, every day, and it's unrelenting. Maybe we've run through our repertoire. Maybe we're looking for new things. People are going online and looking for inspiration ideas at record rates. Google recipe searches when COVID started spiked higher than what they see during holiday periods. So I think that's what's a lot of what's going on here is how do I keep this conveyor belt of foods in my household going? The other thing that we take a look at is the form of the food that people are using. And we ask them, what was the temperature when you purchased the food? So really, this is a nice approximation of where it came from in the grocery set. So about 60% is shelf stable. And by the way, the pie that I'm showing you is pre-COVID. I should have stated that. About a quarter of it is refrigerated or chilled. And then about 13% is frozen. What we found in March, and keep in mind that only the back half of March really was where the stay-at-home and the school and the work-from-home policies kicked in, was we didn't really see this change in terms of a split of what we were using to feed ourselves. So stock-up trips indicated that certain foods were purchased more heavily, like shelf-stable and frozen, for instance. What we are starting to see in the back half of March data, when we eyeball it, and what I expect in April, are some different trends as people start to work through their stockpiles, where we may see more of the frozen foods being pulled out or working through some of the shelf-stable. My coworkers have all heard this, mostly because it's just mind-blowing to me, but my husband's done a lot of our grocery shopping, and I love him to death for it. I had to tell him to stop buying canned tuna because I had 11 cans of tuna. So there are stockpiles that we have amassed and we will work through, and we're watching this. So Mike, I know you're watching the feed. If people want to send some guesses and you want to read them, that could be kind of fun if that'll work from a technology perspective. What I wanted to do now was see if anybody has an idea of which food saw the greatest increases in eatings during March 2020 compared to March 2019. Does anyone have any guesses what that food might have been?
I'll guess cereal. Was Mike.
Okay, no.
Banana bread? We have lots of people guessing bread, pasta, pizza. I think pasta's a good guess. Look at all those guesses. Beans?
No, not yet.
Wine? More people drinking?
Well, this is food.
Wait, wine isn't food? Come on. Ice cream. Ice cream is a good one.
It depends on your perspective. So
Oh my gosh.
number one food that we saw increase was lunch meat. Now,
Oh, wow.
if you listen closely and if I communicated clearly, that's the other piece of it. You may have remembered that several slides ago, I said that the number one meal occasion from restaurants that shifted in home was lunch, because that's the occasion we were most likely to eat out. And there's so few of us, going to work and kids going, to school, that we just have a lot more lunches coming in home. And the number one thing at lunchtime still remains the sandwich, although that, has softened, through the years. So we turned to that tried and true, right? Now, we'll see if that holds true in April, but lunch meat was the number one thing that upticked. Okay, I think you guys are going to pretty much know what the beverage is. And actually, this isn't fair. It's all adult alcoholic beverages. It's not just wine. But that's just my preference. But we actually saw like a 5-fold increase when people told us they were having, atypical occasions with alcoholic beverages. So the memes are true. But what I do want to share with you is while these two categories were the fastest growing, we also had several categories ticking up here in March, which again, wasn't even a full month of change. It was about half of that month where we saw the change. And here's your sandwiches and everything that goes with it, like bread. Or Mike, it could be you on the sourdough train. People started, baking. Also, we see tea, I think is really interesting. I don't know if that's a comfort thing. Picking. Interestingly, fish and seafood has done really well. And it's not just my 11 cans of tuna. It's other types of fin fish. Some really interesting articles in the New York Times about people buying fresh seafood from wholesalers that have pivoted to temporary storefronts and trying new things. Bars and bites upticked. Here's some sweet things like cakes and cupcakes. At dinner, combination dishes, which tend to be like those one dish meals. Maybe it could be a sheet pan meal in the oven. It could be a skillet dish. It could be a casserole, all those kinds of things people turn to. So a lot of big behaviors as we, came in home. I don't think, my guess is going to be that flour, bread, dough, and crust is going to fall off. I think people started baking because it was entertaining, it was comforting, it was something they could also do with their kids. But I don't know if they'll continue it, but we'll see. I could be very much so proven wrong on that. One of the last things I want to share with you about what we do in the home is focusing a little bit on dinner, because like lunch, dinner also does have a significant uptick from restaurant. And while I did say that lunch was the occasion we eat out the most at restaurants and therefore had the biggest shift, we did see dinner settle in at also about a 9% lift. And that's because most of the time when we have dinner at a restaurant, we actually eat it at the restaurant. So a larger share of those dinners are probably coming back home. But what's interesting about this is when we look at how Americans structure their meal in terms of the time investment and what they put into preparing dinners, we've laid it out on a continuum that you see here. And it's a couple of variables that determine what we do. One is the amount of time that you put into prep and cook. Another is the amount of dishes that you made at one occasion. The other one is the amount of ingredients. So it gets at some complexity. And just the message that I want to remind us all around is while we do hear about people experimenting with baking or, maybe using that pasta maker to make something totally from scratch or make those waffles, from scratch, the majority of what we do at dinner time lies here in a fast dinner fix, which is under 10 minutes in total. It does include a lot of sandwiches, some ready-to-eat foods, maybe just warming, something up in the microwave, some frozen foods, those kinds of things. And then another 20% is in simple everyday dinner. So the dishes tend to be simple. They don't have a ton of ingredients, but there are a couple dishes, a lot of like chicken and vegetables go in this space, but there are other things. On average, Americans spend 30 minutes on dinner. And so while we're going to see people on a bell curve way out, using this time to spend more time, we're also going to see people that are really pressed for time to, get dinners on the table more quickly and feed everyone. So I do think that packaged foods and convenience foods certainly still have a role. But at the same time, I do think there's a more assembling going on because of ingredients that we have in our pantry. And, some of the appliances and the technology that, the manufacturers that may be on this call, it's being leveraged in those appliances like multi-cookers and air fryers, et cetera. So just something to keep in mind. I'm going to end, so we have time with questions, with just a couple things about the future. And I'll try to address what I can around what might stick. Remember, I'm not an oracle, but I'll share some thoughts. So first of all, across all of the industries that we travel, that we track, that I showed you at the beginning, we are looking at them against these phases of recovery. And depending on the industry, they're in very different places. And in fact, depending on where you are in the world, and this is just a US view, but we're doing this for all of our global markets, it varies. Now, this is just looking at food service, because retail grocery has not been as disrupted because it's always been open, right? I mean, let me back up. There's nobody in retail grocery that would agree with my statement. It hasn't been disrupted. It clearly has, but it's not like restaurants that have been essentially shut down for a large, portion of them. What this is keying off here, that May 10th date where we're saying we're on the verge of a restart, is by that date, that is a large amount of restaurants will be in states and municipalities where they are allowed to reopen. And in fact, it equates to about 300,000 restaurants. And if they did all reopen, it would bring the restaurants that are up and running to about 50%. Now, the thing is we know that not all restaurants will reopen because they may not be ready. They may not be able to put the safeguards in place or get all of the labor back, or they may have pivoted to carry out and take out, and maybe would struggle to also handle on-premise. But in many instances also, they're only being allowed to open their dining room 25 to 50%, and that may not be profitable enough for them, so they may wait. My point, though, is that in May, we should start to see some increases on the food service side, and some of that in-home lift will lessen a little bit, but I don't think it's anytime soon that we're going to see the broad recovery in restaurant. What I do want to talk about with restaurant, before I talk about what's going on with how we're getting our food in home, is that we know while the restaurant closures happened, that there has been strong growth in online ordering. So that's, using your Domino's app or your Panera app or whatever the case may be, to either order carryout or delivery. But look at this third-party restaurant delivery. So these are the Grubhubs, the DoorDash, the Uber Eats of the world. And one of the things that's also interesting about this is it's bringing in new users and new demographics. And some of the users are older than we traditionally see. So, necessity and concerns about exposure has certainly, driven some of this, as well as it's the only way to access things. If we talk about retail grocery, and what has happened is, first of all, here the green line is brick and mortar. These are store visits. And by the way, this is from our receipt tracking. So we take a look at the trips from people's receipts that they scan and report to us. So you can see this is an index. So this isn't sizing, but this is index. You can see there was an uptick here. This is all of the pantry loading. Really, because to shift this massive brick and mortar number, it takes a lot even to drive this shift. And then you can see by the end of March, after the stockpiling continued and the shutdowns came about, retail grocery has been somewhere around like maybe about an index of 93, so down 6 or 7 percentage points. But there's where online took off. So this is pure play online retailers like Amazon Prime Fresh, for instance. Third-party grocery delivery, this is the Instacart and the Ships of the world. You can see that's grown triple digits. Now it's smaller, but again, and I can tell you that demographically, the boomers and 70 plus that have grown the most in the usage of this. So we've got a lot of people becoming much more familiar with sourcing their food, whether from a restaurant or a grocery store, by digital means. And in many instances, it's worked well. We do know there have been some struggles. There have been some capacity issues. There was a time where Amazon Fresh Prime said, we can't take more people on. We know that meal kits also said that at some point. They have had an uptick. But I do think that there will be, greater adoption of these kinds of behaviors. And in the future, I do think because of, what we've seen, and that because I think we can agree, although we don't necessarily all agree on when's the appropriate time or know when the time is to reopen, that our reopening and our recovery is probably going to be fits and starts. It's going to be a bit of a roller coaster. It may be 2 steps forward and 1 step back if we reopen too soon, for instance. Or what if we don't reopen soon enough and the economy really starts, to show teeth? I think there's been a lot of money pumped into it right now. We may see more things like more ghost kitchens, which were already on the rise because you don't have to maintain that overhead and that of an on-premise dining. We may see more dark stores on the grocery retail side as we rely more on click and collect, pick up curbside or online delivery. But we also may see hybrids coming out of this, where people say, I'm going to hedge my bets on both providing prepared foods from a food service perspective, as well as selling retail grocery. I do think that it will change a bit of the landscape, and certainly there will be a lot of restaurants that aren't, unfortunately, going to survive this. So there's rhymes, there's not a repeat, but I do think on the digital side, as well as the formats, there will be changes. So that's what I had, and thought we could, talk about. I'm sure there's lots of questions.
Yeah, there's tons of questions. Let's get to those in just a bit. I do want to discuss with you a little bit this idea of long-term versus short-term, right? We've already seen some fairly interesting trends that have been phased early in the quarantine time, like a surge of like toilet paper and then people buying flour, but a lot of these things have pulled back. So I'm wondering, will we see a snap back pretty quickly as some of these things like baking bread, and will some of these new behaviors have more staying power?
Yeah. So look, I think that there were some things that we had the initial reaction when this was all new. Like I said, food is experiential, as entertainment. And look, I don't think that the baking of bread levels will stay with what they were initially. But this may introduce and reintroduce some people to baking. So we may see some continued new interest there, certainly. What I would say overall, though, is that we have to remember the monotony in the day-to-day of getting everyone fed, and the fact that people need to figure out efficient ways to get everyone fed, and they're not going to spend hours on every single meal and getting it done. I do think there will be some fatigue around that, but people will pick up new dishes and bring new things into their repertoire. Because if you only had like maybe 10 great things that you did before and you ate out 3 or 4 times a week, you now suddenly need more. The other thing that I think will really signal a bit more of a return to normalcy will be when we start getting out of the home more into school and work. Because when your time becomes constrained, like that, how you interact with food, really changes. So I think, the convenience drivers will come back up. And that probably would be one of the biggest changes. I don't know when that's going to happen, though. Exactly.
So we are having a bit of sound issues. Hopefully that'll go away. But I do want to ask you about generational shifts, right? So I think one of the things I wonder about is, are millennials seeing new learned behaviors? Are baby boomers seeing behaviors? I know that for anecdotally, my own parents started using online grocery for the first time. So just kind of curious what you're seeing there.
I haven't seen a lot of information yet generationally, because I've got that one month data to look at, right? And this is something that you gotta get into. Just two things that I really want to watch. What happens generationally? Particularly Gen Z. Gen Z, front edge of them are turning 23 this year. So majority of them are probably still at home. Only the front edge of them might be living out their own for themselves. However, I do think that it may have accelerated them learning to cook, or thinking about food for sure, right? Millennials, it's interesting because this is the second time now they're going through an economic downturn, and they figured out how to feed themselves.
Susan, real quickly, we're having a bit of audio issue. I just want to ask people: is it? And I want to see in the sound bar, is it Susan's audio? I know I'm having trouble hearing you, Susan. Are people having trouble hearing you? It's more like a kind of a reverb effect. So
let's try.
It's more Susan. Okay, so Susan, if you can maybe refresh your screen, I'll invite you back on, and then we'll just.
Is this any better?
No, I think if you can hit refresh, I'll invite you back on. Hit refresh your screen.
Oh dear, I know how to do that.
The virtual event is always kind of interesting. I think listen, I am going to there we go. I think Susan's going to reconnect. So we've got lots of questions, so hopefully Susan can get back and answer some of those. I will say, I think one of the things that I think has been interesting is I wrote a post just recently about how Instant Pot. Hey, Susan, how are you doing?
I'm good.
Oh, audio's better.
Magic.
So the magic of online events and trying to get them to work. Well, I actually think, I'm going to go to questions because we have quite a few, and we got the audio fixed. So hooray. But one of the questions was from Yagmer, and I hope I got your name right. What is the impact of these changing habits on the future? And we're kind of getting at that. I was asked about that a little bit, but what will we carry on into our future lives? What will be temporary versus permanent? I think online grocery shopping is one of those things that we're not going to go back on. I think my parents, they're in their 70s. They started using it for the first time. I don't see them stopping that. What do you think?
No, I think that COVID has been an accelerator overall for everything online and digital. And I think it's been, in particular, an echo chamber, an accelerator for food, which has lagged behind lots of other spaces in retail. I think there's lots of things we're learning. One is we can work efficiently from home. Nobody wants to go back into their office. That's one thing. We've learned that technology also can make it easier to get food to come to us. And I think, the other thing that we haven't talked about is that'll be lasting is a lot of people are hesitant about returning to restaurants even when they do open. And the people that are most hesitant about doing that are the people who are using online delivery. That's why they're using it in many instances. So it's going to be slow. I'll tell you, we were talking to our counterparts in China. We have offices in Shanghai and Beijing and in other areas of Asia. And, food service for them has clawed its way back by about 17 points. They were also down about 60% in terms of traffic in January, which started in February. March, it started coming back. The things that came back first, I thought were most telling. And this points to what I say about when our normal routines start to return. I think that's when we'll see food return to a little bit more of a normal. The first thing that they did was return to the drink station channel in China. which would be, like teas and probably things I don't even know what they are, that upticked. People were getting out of the house and going to work, and they returned to tea, coffee, or whatever. And those those food service outlets also offered little single, light meals. And the other thing that grew was hot pot. Started making single hot pot meals. So this idea of just one person, not even social eating yet, going out. So I think that's what you're going to see over time, but that home is still going to be where a lot of all of our meals, are happening. And we are going to use digital more to get the food into the home, whether it's from the restaurant or the store.
There have been a few people commenting on and wondering about plant-based food. One of the things I wonder about is, I've seen a lot of values-driven eating over the past 5 years. People are eating their values more. They're looking at alternatives to meat.
Yeah.
But we're also seeing right now during the pandemic, people are moving towards cheaper cuts of meat. They're maybe using more plastic waste because it's more of a survival mode. What are your thoughts on particularly plant-based meat? And then do we also see a setback on values-driven eating?
Yeah. Like so many things, it's a mixed bag, right? So one of the things we've had this discussion on plant-based because what we hear from, Beyond Meat and I think Impossible Meat is that their sales are growing. They have to keep in mind that they are still gaining distribution. So it's not entirely clear to me how much of it is gaining distribution and trial versus people using it ongoing. I mean, this is the perfect incubator for that, right? If people are going to have meat shortages or want to try something different, now's the time for them to be out there. I think the jury is still out on that. But keep in mind, the number one reason that people tell us across all generations that they have tried plant-based meat alternatives is for health reasons. The sustainability or the value aspect of it is a tertiary or lower driver. Now, it is more important, the values behind it, to Gen Z and Millennial than Gen X and Boomer. But across the board, it has been perceived as a more healthful option. And the majority of people who use it, 89%, are meat eaters. So it's not driven by a vegan lifestyle, by and large. So I think you're right about the price point. I do think in some instances, some of the value equations that people are making in their mind have been put by the wayside because now we have to think about, can it be reusable? Is it disposable? I don't want to, it's got to be contactless. Unfortunately, I think that is going to set back some of that on the packaging side, at least.
Yeah.
But what I don't know is longer term as we come out of this is, are those values going to return, and will they return even stronger?
Right. Real quick, I just want to call attention to our poll. About 1/4 of people have baked bread for the first time. Hooray.
For sure. Mm-hmm.
I did get the pro tip in the side. I've had trouble finding yeast. Every time I go to the grocery store, I look for yeast. And I realized that I could just bake beer bread. So that's a pro tip.
There you go.
I do want to get to an interesting question that someone submitted about kitchen design. This is from Laura Ciampa. I hope I got that right. She asks, do you think changing food habits will drive changes in kitchen design? Now, that's a great question for Johnny, our conversation next week. But this is also one I'd love for you to talk about. Do you think that kitchen design over time will change? And I wonder if we can maybe look back at previous downturns and wondering what happened in terms of kitchen design based on the Great Recession in 2008, and then maybe even the Great Depression, going back that far.
Oh, geez. That was a chicken. That was a chicken in every pot.
I don't mean implying the age. I'm not, but
we had stoves with pots and chickens.
Yeah.
And then we got microwave. No, boy, that's a little bit out of my range.
I wonder if the move towards digital ordering and people just buying meals through online grocery stores. We've certainly seen a change in professional kitchens as we've seen the rise of food ordering. It'll be interesting to see as we see more of these things like Instant Pots come into the home and these types of countertop devices, if that'll drive changes in the kitchen design over time.
Yeah, I don't know. And I don't know if any of those will ever move to be a built-in. The microwave was a counter top appliance originally, right? And how many of them are built in now? The other thing I could potentially see, if people are using leftovers more or ordering online, will that drive an increase in the desire for the refrigerator that tracks your inventory, or for those kinds of things? I mean, that's a possibility.
You did see a run on freezers, right? Like in second fridges, like early in COVID, I think people were looking for more storage capacity.
Yes, there was a point in time where you could not buy a chest freezer. Definitely, people added that space because they wanted to stock up. Now, will they bring that into their kitchen design, or will they, allow that to be in the garage or down in the basement? I'm not sure. One thing that I could be interesting in, I mean, we've seen this walking. Well, it's now the Inspired Home Show, but the International Houseware Show is for years now. There's been these great kitchen gardens. That like the countertop, and I know some of the majors. I think, was it GE that introduced? It looked like a wine refrigerator. There's
about 4 of the big appliance makers were always talking or showing off stuff at CES, and we've had people actually pointing out that they're going to be gardening more come springtime, because I think the people are thinking about producing their own food. So I wonder if maybe some of that moves into the kitchen.
Some of that could move into the kitchen. And I have to tell you, like living in a colder climate, because I'm up in Michigan, and we're going to have a hard frost tomorrow night. It would be really nice to be able to grow greens year round and have that. And I do think one of the things that people will continue to look for through this is local. Clearly, like, let's just think about some of the shifts. I know that I've paid more attention and visited my local butcher more than I ever did, because I couldn't get chicken at the store, and it prompted me to go, oh, what about Earl? And he had a supply. So there also may be some local, I don't know if that'll, impact kitchen design, but yeah.
Eileen Smith asks, she'd like to know how shopping, cooking, and eating during the pandemic has changed people's attitudes towards nutrition. Are people more or less interested? I mean, I think maybe there's a little bit of evidence, at least in the initial phases, people are doing more comfort food, eating more carbs, and maybe a little less at least at the outset. I
think it's a mixed bag again. And I think it kind of, like so much of the American consumer is interesting. We refer in the health area to people as belonging to a tribe, right? Where we've seen people's perception of wellness and health. A lot of it's influenced by the fact that we have unlimited access to information through social media. And we don't, it's not the old days of you listen to what your doctor necessarily says. There's lots of influencers out there. You can find your keto tribe. You can find, your turmeric tribe. You can find it out there. So I think there's lots of people doing different things. Yes, there are signals that comfort foods and snacking are up. There absolutely is. On the other hand, though, I'm waiting for the data, but what I've seen in talking to other people in the industry is that things around immunity support and mental health support, managing stress, managing anxiety and mood is a really big concern. And food has started to play a role in that. And food is medicine even before COVID. So COVID again could be an accelerator for that. Hearing things about interest in like anti-inflammatory. It's small, but more people are looking at like the AIP protocol diet, which is, about autoimmune. Now that may be because some people are having a hard time managing any kind of autoimmune situation they have going on. But I think people in general, more broadly, will be thinking about, how do I keep my defenses up? How do I keep my immunity up? And how do I keep myself sane? And it could be comfort foods, or it could be eating foods to help support mood.
It's interesting. Someone asked about what has been the impact on keto diets. I was mentioning earlier that we did a post where we got some data from Instant Pot, and at least searches on their device and on their website, keto really tanked hard in the first half of March and in April, as people were embracing things like baking bread, et cetera. So there are some of those definite signals out there that certain types of diet have taken a hit, but you wonder if that'll snap back as people get back to their normal routines.
It might. I mean, we hear about the COVID-19, and at some point people may say, hey, I need to go back to this. On the other hand, we know that Peloton has had record sales. We know that so sample of one, I'm working from home, so I'm not on an airplane. I'm not driving my kid to school and, to activities. I've in effect gained some time, and I'm able to work out more consistently than ever. But everybody is having a different experience. Really, that's part of it. Everybody's having a different experience with their time and finances.
One thing I want to ask you real quickly before we wrap it up is one of the speakers on our COVID-19 summit we had about a month ago, Robert Eggers, talked about the need for restaurants thinking about their menus and moving towards lower cost options. I think one thing that is clear is consumers are probably going to have less money in their pockets over the next couple of years. Yep. What does that mean for restaurants from a menu development perspective? Do they need to completely rethink it? Is the idea of like the $30 pizza for one or whatever, the really high end meals, are those going away and people and restaurants have to rethink their menus and move towards lower cost options?
Well, so first of all, the food service never recovered to pre-recessionary levels from the last recession. It's been a 0 to 1-2%, growth in terms of traffic. The other thing to keep in mind is 80% of food service is quick serve. And last time how they generated sales and were successful were through limited time offers, getting people in, on interesting things, variety and different things, as well as there was some of, the $5 footlong that, value did drive it. But let's not forget that during that recessionary period is where we saw the rise of fast casual. Fast casual is the Chipotle, the Panera. It's the restaurants that it's a higher dollar per trip. You're going to spend more. You're not going to get out of Chipotle for under $11, right? But you can go to McDonald's, and I'm not picking on anyone, but there's a price disparity. But there's also a perceived quality and experience level difference, and the millennials wanted that, and a lot of it was driven kind of by values eating, right? Because if you think about where Panera has gone and where Chipotle started with trying to do local or antibiotic free or, whatever the case was. So that came about during a recessionary period. So my answer to you is that we'll always have both. People will be willing sometimes to cut back on the amount of times maybe they go out to have a different experience. But there are going to be people too that are just going to need value and are just going to need to feed the family. And then there's going to be the people that can afford and want the $30 pizza. You just got to find your audience, and it's got to be the right value equation.
Well, Susan Schwallie, I want to thank you for this. I think everyone has loved hearing your insights and really appreciated your data. We will follow up with some links to where they can find you, but if you had to tell people where they can find you online, do you have like a Twitter handle?
I do. It's just Susan
We'll send
Schwallie.
it to people if you don't have it.
I'll send it, and I'm on LinkedIn. I'm more active on LinkedIn than Twitter. I'm Gen X. I don't get
You're a market analyst. I get that.
Yeah.
So.
LinkedIn, you can find me, susan.schwallie@npd.com. And I do want to say, guys and gals, npd.com, we are publishing a tremendous amount of information on our COVID tracking, food service and food, because, we really want people to have data-driven insights. There's a lot of noise out there as to what's going on. Please check out npd.com because we're posting new things every day in terms of what's going on across all our industries.
Well, thank you for sharing some of those insights that you guys share every day. You guys do have a wealth of data, and I appreciate you diving deep into that and preparing that presentation. You've had a lot of people commenting and thanking you, so I appreciate it, and I thank you as well. And we'll say goodbye to everyone until next time. Thanks, Susan.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Bye, guys.